Thank you very much. It is one of the last, I guess, lecture of the term, so it may be a sacrifice for you to come. But as it is my point, I will try to demonstrate that sacrifice is not sacrificial, so it may be less painful for you to attend the lecture. I would like to propose, to suggest the sketch of a phenomenological concept of sacrifice, which means precisely a concept of sacrifice which could be directly connected to phenomenological issues and not to the usual understanding of sacrifice in sociological and even religious studies. Let us start with the aporia of sacrifice. Strictly speaking, it should not be necessary to begin with sacrifice, at least in the usual meaning of the word. Since sacrifice, sacrificium, always results from the action of a verb, of the verb to make sacred, sacrum facere. The sacrifice appears once an agent has written something sacred, has set it apart from the profane, and thereby consecrated it. Moreover, sacrum facere was rendered in Old French by sacrifiement, not sacrifice only, which meant distinctly the procedure of returning something sacred more than the result of this process. So the question of sacrifice concerns first and above all the act of making something sacred and of snatching it from the profane, the act from which sacrifice only results and thus is content to record without explaining. This precision, nevertheless, raises another difficulty. How can we conceive the transition between the two terms, I mean the profane and the sacred? Well, the very distinction becomes, in the time of nihilism in which we live, this distinction becomes confused, indistinct, and if not totally whipped out. Everything happened as if the death of God, and above all what has triggered it, has abolished every difference between the sacred and the profane, thus every possibility for us of crossing over it by a sacrificement, or contrary, by a profanation. Would not sacrifice disappear with the sacred that is erased? Nevertheless, this is not entirely the way it goes. We have a common, if not vulgar, sense of sacrifice. The sacrifice is equivalent to destroying, or more precisely, to destroying what should not be, at least in a normal custom of the word, be destroyed. That is, the useful, what can be used, the ready to use. In effect, being in the sense where I use it at end, the zuhanden, to speak the language of Heidegger, is defined by the finality that sends it back not only to other ready-for-use beings, but, at the end, to my own intention, which gathers the subordinated finalities of these beings into a network of final, so to speak, finalities, which are all oriented toward myself as the center of the surrounding world. This being, not only useful but at end and actually used, zuhanden, refers to myself and, in that extent, becomes for me my own word. It is good insofar as it is mine, and it is good insofar as it is my good. As a result, doing away with it would amount to me doing away with myself. And if, crossing a step further in the negation, I were to destroy it, then I would be destroyed myself. And yet, such destruction of a good as good, and even as my own good, thus this destruction of myself has not disappeared completely in our time and is still kept, perhaps unduly, under the title of sacrifice. We experience the aid of it every day under the title of terrorism. Propaganda and public media appeal in effect to the semantics of sacrifice in order to name terrorist acts. The terrorist, it is said, sacrifices himself for his cause, or indeed he sacrifices the life of other uncertain victims for the advertisement of his very cause, ideology, or revendication. This way of speaking, as approximate and thus abusive as it may be, nevertheless retains some pertinence. Because pure violence, without any moral or even political justification, in its stupidity and barbarism, arose indeed a paralyzing dread before an act that, by definition, no longer deals with the world of living beings or the community of reasonable people, but obeys the logic of another world, absurd in our own, which it denies and annihilates as well. Terrorism does away with goods, innocent people, and the terrorist himself, because it accomplishes first and radically the destruction of all being as useful and as at end, zuanden, thus of the final organization of any world for us. Thus destroyed, the being at end, zuanden, become the sacred insofar as it is no longer belongs to the world where we can and used to live, where it is a matter of living in the normality of the profane. So let us admit that terror under these polymorphous figures remains today our last experience of the sacred, and that this figure of the sacred, as debased as it proves to be, nevertheless allows us a vulgar understanding of sacrifice. That is to say, sacrifice means that which renders a profane thing sacred. The terrorists produce the sacred under the figure of absurd horror by destroying life, here including his own. The process that makes the profane sacred does not refrain from the destruction of the thing sacrificed in this way. At least some access to sacrifice remains open to us, since the experience of terrorism guarantees us, although in a perverse way, the destruction of the good as such. Nevertheless, this first result, by allowing us an undisputable, because perfectly negative access to the sacred and to the sacrifiement, only reinforces the aporia. For it is not only a question of discussing that destruction. For it is not only a question of discussing that destruction, whether that destruction is the only figure of sacrifice left today, but above all of noticing how far, even in this figure, its unintelligibility remains highly problematic. What in effect would destroying a good have to do with rendering it sacred? What does sacrifice do if it does only undo? What can it consecrate if it is content with itself with annihilation? To what or to whom can it give, since it nullifies the content of any gift and is itself nullifying and itself nullifies itself as a possible giver. The definition of sacrifice as destruction of a good as such not only explain nothing of sacrifice, but it could explain exactly the opposite, the auto-appropriation of autarky. In effect, the wise man, according to ancient Greeks, for instance, the wise man wants to get rid of any good by destroying it and thus becoming free of it. The wise man alone can do this, and it it to himself by surviving what he destroys in himself, making a sacrifice of other good by renunciation, ascesis, and so on. He demonstrates to the others his own self-sufficiency, or rather, it proves at least to himself alone his autonomy and ataraxy. Sacrifice, if understood that way, becomes the auto-celebration of the ascetic ideal, where the ego attains, by no longer owing anything to anyone, a kind of causa sui. Sacrifice, understood as destruction of a good, can be reversed by a construction of the self, which sacrifices nothing of itself, save the word to itself. This is the aporia, the first aporia of sacrifice. We must thus give up any definition of sacrifice only by the destruction of a good alone. In fact, it may become more appropriate to consider another concept of sacrifice by introducing a third term beyond the one achieving the sacrifice and the nullified, destroyed good. That third term is precisely the third, the other. Even in the most banal meaning of sacrifice, says the sacrifice of a pawn or figure in chess, already the other appears, be it under the minimum aspect of the mimetic rival of the other myself, of my opponent. Making this so-called sacrifice, I do not want to give up my position. It is a question of my position vis-à-vis his or her position, and I sacrifice this piece to him or her. In brief, my sacrifice always assumes the other as its horizon of possibility. The other determines the destruction of the good, then either by gaining it as its new owner, I transfer it to him or her by giving it up, or by extending my own loss to my rival. I give it up in order to deprive him of it. In this new sense, where it happens in the horizon of the other, does sacrifice become more intelligible than in the previous case, when understood as pure and simple destruction of a good? Without doubt, since we immediately notice that it is in fact no longer about destruction, but about privation with destruction, but not always with a destruction, time to time without it. And this on both sides of the alternative. On one hand, let me give up a good because I can do without it, and in this way strengthen my autonomy. In other words, I deprive myself of a good just to prove to myself, or to the other, that it has only an optional importance for me, and that I remain myself even without it. In this way, by losing a good other than me, myself, I win a more perfect possession of myself. On the other hand, let me give up a good, not at all because I would simply destroy it, but because by destroying it, or rendering it only unavailable to me, I want to disown it to the point that, by this definitive loss, others might possibly appropriate it in my place. In fact, I display this given up good so that it becomes available for others to appropriate.